The scorching sun bore down mercilessly upon the dusty trail that stretched endlessly westward, disappearing into the shimmering heat waves that danced above the barren landscape. It was the summer of 1870, and the American frontier remained as unforgiving as ever, a vast expanse of dreams and nightmares where hope and despair walked hand in hand. Margaret Sullivan pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it offered little protection from the blazing heat. Her once pristine dress, now faded and dust-covered, hung loosely on her diminished frame. She had been walking for 3 days now, each step taking her farther from the mining town of Silver Creek and the memories that haunted its streets. The ravens circled overhead, their harsh cries the only sound breaking the oppressive silence of the trail. Margaret's lips were cracked and bleeding, her throat parched beyond description. The small canteen she carried had run dry yesterday morning, and the meager provisions in her cloth bundle, a half loaf of stale bread and some dried meat, were nearly gone. She stumbled over a rock, catching herself before falling completely. Her hands, once soft and delicate, were now blistered and raw, but physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. Thomas had been dead for only 2 weeks, crushed in a mine collapse that took 3 other men with him. The mining company had offered no compensation, no sympathy, only an eviction notice for the company housing they had shared. The townspeople of Silver Creek had shown their true colors in her darkest hour. The women whispered behind their fans, calling her bad luck, a jinx. The men looked at her with eyes that held either pity or something far worse. The banker had made his intentions clear when he offered to help her with her debts, his hand lingering too long on her arm, his breath reeking of whiskey and false promises. Margaret forced one foot in front of the other, her vision beginning to blur. The landscape around her was a palette of browns and tans, sagebrush, rocks, and endless dirt. Occasionally, a lizard would scurry across the path, or a tumbleweed would roll past. But otherwise, she was utterly alone. She thought of Thomas, of his gentle hands blackened by coal dust, of his laugh that could fill their tiny home with warmth even on the coldest nights. He had promised her a better life out west, away from the crowded tenements of Chicago where they had met. He had painted pictures with his words, of green valleys, clear streams, and a little ranch where they would raise horses and children. Now those dreams lay buried with him in the rocky soil of Silver Creek Cemetery, marked only by a simple wooden cross that would weather away within a few seasons. The sun climbed higher, and Margaret's shadow shortened beneath her feet. Her legs felt like lead, each step requiring enormous effort. She had no destination in mind, only the vague notion of reaching California, where perhaps she could find work as a seamstress or a teacher. Anything to start anew, away from the suffocating judgment and memories. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she paused, swaying on her feet. The trail seemed to tilt and spin. She reached out for something to steady herself, but there was nothing, only empty air and the vast indifference of the wilderness. Her knees buckled, and she fell hard onto the packed earth. The impact sent a cloud of dust into the air, coating her already parched throat. She tried to push herself up, but her arms had no strength left. The bundle of her possessions rolled away, spilling its pitiful contents across the trail. Margaret lay there, cheek pressed against the hot ground, feeling the earth's heat seeping through her clothes. Her breathing came in short, labored gasps. This was how it would end. She thought with a strange sense of detachment, alone on a trail to nowhere. Another forgotten soul claimed by the harsh frontier. Through her dimming vision, she saw her wedding ring glinting in the sunlight, the thin gold band that Thomas had saved for months to buy. She tried to reach for it, to hold on to this last connection to love and happier times. But her hand fell short, fingers clawing weakly at the dirt. The ravens circled lower now, their shadows passing over her prone form. In the distance, a coyote howled, though whether in greeting or farewell, she could not tell. The sounds of the world began to fade, replaced by a strange ringing in her ears. As consciousness slipped away, Margaret thought she heard something else, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats approaching. Her eyes, barely open now, caught a glimpse of movement, a figure on horseback, silhouetted against the merciless sun. Man or mirage, angel or devil. She could not tell. Her last coherent thought was a prayer, not for salvation, but simply for an end to the pain. The rider dismounted, his moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He moved with the fluid grace of one born to this unforgiving land, his long shadow falling across the unconscious woman. The horse, a painted Mustang, snorted softly and pawed the ground. For a long moment, the warrior stood still, taking in the scene before him, the scattered belongings, the wedding ring glinting in the dust, the pale woman whose breath came in barely perceptible whispers. The desert had claimed many, both his people and hers, but something in this moment held him. Perhaps it was the way her fingers still reached toward the ring, or perhaps it was simply that he, too, knew the weight of loss. The sun continued its relentless journey across the sky, and the warrior made his decision. Whatever fate had brought them to this moment on this desolate trail, he would not let the desert claim another soul today, not while he still drew breath. The warrior knelt beside the fallen woman, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency as he checked for signs of life. Her pulse fluttered weakly beneath his fingers, like a wounded bird's heartbeat. Standing Moon had seen death take many forms in his 30 winters, but this woman still clung to life with a tenacity that surprised him. He studied her for a moment, the torn dress that spoke of better days, the blistered hands that had known work, the gold ring that caught the afternoon light. His people had learned to read the stories written in such details. This was no saloon woman or camp follower, but someone who had known a home, perhaps even happiness, before the desert had brought her low. Without hesitation, Standing Moon lifted her slight frame, noting how little she weighed. Starvation and grief had already begun their work. In one smooth motion, he shifted her across his broad shoulder, her arms hanging limp, her auburn hair spilling down his back like a waterfall of copper. The position was practical, leaving his hands free for the reins while distributing her weight evenly. His Mustang, trained to remain steady under any burden, merely flicked an ear as Standing Moon mounted with his unconscious cargo. The woman made no sound, no movement, as they began the journey to his temporary shelter hidden in a grove of cottonwoods near a small spring. 2 hours' ride to the north. The sun had begun its descent when Margaret first stirred. Pain shot through her body as awareness returned. Her shoulder ached from the uncomfortable position. Her throat burned with thirst, and her head pounded with each movement of the horse beneath them. Panic seized her as she realized she was being carried like a sack of grain over someone's shoulder. She began to struggle weakly, her fists beating ineffectively against the strong back beneath her. A deep voice spoke words she didn't understand, the language flowing like water over stones. The calm tone did nothing to ease her terror. She had heard stories of what happened to white women taken by Indians, stories whispered in boarding houses and general stores, each more horrific than the last. "Please," she croaked, her voice barely audible. "Please, let me go." The horse slowed, then stopped. She felt herself being lifted, then carefully lowered to the ground. Her legs, weak from days of walking and lack of food, immediately gave way. Strong arms caught her before she could fall, setting her gently against a large boulder. Margaret's first clear look at her captor, or savior, she wasn't sure which, made her shrink back against the rock. Standing Moon was tall, his skin bronzed by the sun, his black hair worn long and held back by a leather band. His face was angular, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that watched her with an unreadable expression. He wore a simple shirt of soft hide and canvas pants, a knife at his belt the only visible weapon. He stepped back, giving her space, then moved to his horse and retrieved a water skin, approaching slowly, as one might approach a frightened animal. He held it out to her. Margaret's thirst overcame her fear. She grabbed the water skin with shaking hands, drinking greedily until he gently pulled it away. Speaking again in his language, the message was clear. Too much too fast would make her sick. They had stopped at the edge of a small grove of trees. In the distance, she could see the faint outline of a structure, a rough cabin or large shelter. Standing Moon pointed to it, then to her, then made a walking gesture with his fingers. When she didn't move, he sighed and simply scooped her up again, this time cradling her in his arms rather than over his shoulder. Margaret wanted to protest, to maintain some dignity, but she had no strength left. She turned her face away from him, tears streaming down her cheeks. Everything was wrong. Thomas was dead. She was lost in the wilderness, and now she was at the mercy of a savage who probably intended unspeakable things. The shelter turned out to be a well-built lean-to, backed against a cluster of rocks with a small fire pit in front. Clear water bubbled from a spring nearby, forming a small pool before disappearing into the sandy ground. Standing Moon set her down on a pile of blankets inside the shelter, then immediately moved away, busying himself with building a fire. Margaret watched warily as he worked, noting the efficiency of his movements, the care with which he arranged the kindling. When the fire crackled to life, he filled a small pot with water from the spring and set it to heat. From a parfleche bag, he produced what looked like dried corn and some kind of meat, adding them to the pot. The smell of cooking food made Margaret's stomach clench painfully. She couldn't remember when she'd last eaten. Standing Moon must have noticed her hungry gaze, for he reached into another bag and pulled out some dried berries, offering them to her on a piece of bark. She hesitated, pride warring with need. He set the bark down within her reach and returned to tending the fire, not looking at her. After a moment, Margaret reached for the berries, eating them one by one, letting their sweetness dissolve on her tongue. As the sun set and shadows lengthened, Standing Moon brought her the pot of corn porridge, along with a carved wooden spoon. He set it beside her and retreated to the other side of the fire, where he sat cross-legged, working on what appeared to be arrow fletching. Margaret ate slowly, the warm food bringing life back to her body. She studied her captor, for she still thought of him as such, from beneath lowered lashes. He seemed to be ignoring her completely, focused on his work. Perhaps the stories were wrong. Perhaps not all Indians were the bloodthirsty savages the newspapers described. When she finished eating, exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. Her eyelids grew heavy, and despite her fear, she found herself sliding down onto the blankets. They smelled of sage and wood smoke, strangely comforting. Standing Moon rose and added more wood to the fire, then settled himself near the entrance of the shelter, his back against a post. The knife now laid across his lap. Guard or protector? Margaret couldn't tell. But as sleep claimed her, she had to admit that for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt a small measure of safety. Tomorrow would bring new fears, new challenges. But tonight, at least, she was warm, fed, and sheltered from the harsh world outside. Standing Moon listened to her breathing deepen into sleep. He had not planned to involve himself with the troubles of white settlers. Their presence had brought nothing but sorrow to his people. But the woman had been dying, and his mother had taught him that to pass by suffering when one could help was to diminish one's own spirit. He thought of his own losses, his wife and son, taken by the spotted sickness 3 winters past, his village scattered by soldiers, his brother killed defending their ancestral lands. The woman across the fire had her own ghosts. He had seen it in her eyes, the hollow look of one who had lost everything. Perhaps that was why he had stopped. In her grief, he recognized his own. In her struggle to survive, he saw the same fierce will that kept him moving through each day, even when the weight of memory threatened to crush him. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Standing Moon shifted slightly, alert to every sound, every movement in the night. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight he would keep watch. It was a small thing, but perhaps small things were all anyone could offer in this hard land. A drink of water, a warm meal, a safe place to rest. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the small human dramas below, and the desert night wrapped around the unlikely pair like a blanket, holding them in its vast silence. Dawn painted the desert in shades of rose and gold, the light creeping across the landscape like a gentle hand smoothing rumpled fabric. Margaret woke to the sound of water trickling from the spring and the soft nickering of horses. For a moment, confusion gripped her. Where was she? Then memory rushed back, and with it, fear. Standing Moon was nowhere in sight. His blanket lay folded near the fire pit, which still held glowing embers. A fresh pot of water steamed beside it, and next to that, a piece of flatbread wrapped in cloth. Margaret sat up slowly, her body protesting every movement. She was alone, yet provision had been made for her morning meal. She crept to the shelter's entrance and peered out. The warrior stood by the spring, stripped to the waist, washing in the cold water. Margaret quickly averted her eyes, heat rising to her cheeks. When she looked again, he had donned his shirt and was walking back toward the shelter, carrying what appeared to be fresh rabbit. "You are awake," he said, and Margaret started violently. He spoke English, accented but clear. You speak English?" The words came out as barely more than a whisper. "The missionaries taught me, long ago." His expression remained neutral as he began preparing the rabbit. Before the soldiers came, an awkward silence fell between them. Margaret wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, watching as he worked with quick, efficient movements. Finally, she gathered courage to speak. "Why did you help me?" Standing Moon didn't look up from his task. "Would you prefer I had not?" "No, that's not what I meant." She swallowed hard. "I mean, why would you help a white woman?" Now he did look at her, his dark eyes holding something she couldn't quite read. Death does not care about the color of skin. Neither should mercy. Margaret had no answer to that. She ate the flatbread in small bites, her stomach still tender from days of near starvation. The morning air was cool, but she could already feel the heat building, promising another scorching day. "What's your name?" she asked finally. "Standing Moon," he replied. "And you?" Margaret Sullivan." The name felt strange on her tongue. Incomplete. I am a widow." He nodded as if this explained everything. "Where were you walking?" "California, I thought, or anywhere that wasn't Silver Creek." Tears threatened, but she forced them back. "My husband died in the mines. There was nothing left for me there. California is many days' walk, with no water, no food. You chose death." The blunt words stung, but they were true. "Maybe I did," she admitted quietly. "It seemed easier than the alternative." Standing Moon set aside the cleaned rabbit and studied her. "Your spirit is stronger than you know. You walked 3 days in the desert. Many would have given up after one. Over the following days, a routine developed. Standing Moon would leave at dawn to hunt or scout, always ensuring Margaret had water and food before he left. She began to help where she could, tending the fire, preparing simple meals with the supplies he brought. Their conversations were brief at first, careful exchanges about practical matters. On the 4th day, as she struggled to communicate that the water pot needed filling, he began teaching her words in his language. "Tu," he said, pointing to the water. "Ko," for fire. She repeated them clumsily, making him almost smile, the first break in his stoic expression. Margaret told him about Thomas during a particularly quiet evening, the words spilling out like water through a broken dam, how they'd met at a dance in Chicago, his dreams of striking it rich in the goldfields, the crushing poverty that drove them west, the cave-in that took him and left her with nothing but debt and desperate men circling like vultures. Standing Moon listened without interrupting, his face illuminated by the firelight. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "My wife was called Singing Rain," he said slowly. "She had a laugh like water over stones. My son, Little Eagle, had just learned to walk when the spotted sickness came. I was away, trading with the white settlement. When I returned," he trailed off, staring into the flames. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. understanding now the sadness that lived behind his eyes. 3 winters have passed. The pain becomes different, not less, but different. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. My people are scattered. The soldiers pushed us from our lands, sent us to different places. I stay here because the memories are here, good mixed with bad. They sat in companionable silence. 2 souls marked by loss, finding unexpected comfort in shared grief. The desert night wrapped around them, vast and eternal, making their sorrows seem both insignificant and profound. As the days passed, Margaret grew stronger. Standing Moon showed her which plants could be eaten, how to find water in seemingly dry places, how to read the signs of coming weather. She proved a quick student, driven by a determination not to be helpless again. One morning, she woke to find him preparing his horse. Fear clutched at her heart. Was he leaving? But he gestured for her to come outside and pointed to a second horse, a gentle mare he had somehow acquired. "You cannot walk to California," he said simply. "Learn to ride." The lessons were humbling. Margaret had ridden in carriages but never astride a horse. She fell repeatedly, earning bruises and wounded pride in equal measure. But Standing Moon was patient, steadying her with gentle hands, teaching her to move with the horse rather than against it. During one particularly frustrating attempt, she slipped again, landing hard in the dust. Tears of frustration welled up, and she pounded the ground with her fist. "I can't do this! I'm not meant for this life!" Standing Moon dismounted and crouched beside her. The woman who walked 3 days without water, who survived when death seemed certain, that woman can learn to ride a horse. His faith in her, so simply stated, cut through her self-pity. She let him help her to her feet, brushed off the dust, and mounted again. This time, she managed to stay on, even achieving a slow walk around the clearing. That evening, as she nursed her sore muscles by the fire, Standing Moon surprised her by producing a small leather pouch. Inside was a mixture of herbs that, when steeped in hot water, created a tea that eased her aches. "Thank you," she said, meaning more than just the tea. He nodded, understanding. "Tomorrow, we practice again." "Standing Moon?" She hesitated, then forged ahead. "Why are you really helping me? You could have left me with water and food and ridden away." He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps because in saving you, I save a part of myself. The part that died with them." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She reached across the space between them, briefly touching his hand where it rested on his knee. He didn't pull away, and for a moment, they sat connected by that small touch. 2 broken people finding in each other a reason to keep living. The stars emerged one by one, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang its lonely song to the moon. But around their small fire, the silence felt less empty, the night less cold. Healing, Margaret was learning, came not from forgetting the past, but from finding someone who understood its weight. The morning sun climbed steadily as Margaret and Standing Moon made their way toward the creek that ran through a narrow canyon, their water skins nearly empty after several days of rationing. Margaret had become more confident on horseback, though she still gripped the reins tighter than necessary whenever the mare picked up speed. They heard the voices before they saw the men, rough laughter mixed with the clink of bottles. Standing Moon raised his hand, signaling her to stop. Through the scattered brush, they could see 5 white men lounging by the water's edge. Their horses hobbled nearby. Empty whiskey bottles littered the ground around them. "We should go," Standing Moon whispered, already turning his mount, but one of the men had spotted them. "Well, well, what have we here?" He stood unsteadily, squinting in their direction. "Boys, looks like we got ourselves a squaw man and his woman." The others scrambled to their feet, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. Margaret's heart pounded as they approached, spreading out in a loose semicircle. She recognized the type: drifters and fortune hunters, men with no law but their own desires. The apparent leader, a heavy-set man with greasy red hair, spat tobacco juice at Standing Moon's feet. "Indian, what are you doing with a white woman? You steal her?" "We're just passing through," Margaret said quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. "We mean no trouble." The red-haired man's eyes raked over her, taking in her worn dress and sunburned face. "That's so. Don't look like no respectable woman to me, riding with a savage. You one of them fallen women, Indian's woman now?" The other men laughed, ugly sounds that made Margaret's skin crawl. One of them, younger than the rest with pale blue eyes, moved closer. Maybe she needs reminding what a real man feels like. Standing Moon shifted his horse slightly, placing himself between Margaret and the men. His hand hadn't moved to his knife, but every line of his body spoke of readiness. "We take water and go," he said evenly. "No trouble, no trouble," the red-haired man laughed. "You hear that, boys? The savage thinks he can tell us what to do." He took a swig from a bottle, then pointed it at Margaret. "How about you come down off that horse, missy, and be sociable? We ain't seen a woman in weeks. Leave her alone." Standing Moon's voice carried a warning that even drunk men couldn't miss. The pale-eyed youth wasn't deterred. He lurched forward, reaching for Margaret's horse's bridle. "Come on, sweetheart. Don't be unfriendly." His words cut off as Standing Moon's horse suddenly reared, its hooves striking out. The young man stumbled backward, cursing. In the confusion, Standing Moon had dismounted, now standing between Margaret and the men, his knife finally in his hand. "You dare pull a blade on white men?" The leader's face had turned an ugly purple. "Boys, I think this Indian needs a lesson in respect." The fight erupted with shocking speed. Two men rushed Standing Moon at once. He sidestepped the first, using the man's momentum to send him crashing into a boulder. The second caught him with a glancing blow to the ribs, but Standing Moon's knife flashed, opening a long cut on the attacker's arm. Margaret watched in terror as three more men closed in. Standing Moon fought with a fluid grace, but the odds were overwhelming. A fist caught him in the jaw, snapping his head back. Another man grabbed his knife arm, trying to wrestle the weapon away. "Stop!" Margaret screamed, but her voice was lost in the chaos. The pale-eyed youth, blood streaming from his nose where Standing Moon's horse had struck him, grabbed a rifle. "I'll kill the red bastard!" Without thinking, Margaret spurred her horse forward, riding straight at him. The mare's shoulder caught him squarely, sending him flying. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air. Standing Moon had managed to break free, but blood ran from a cut above his eye, and he favored his left side. The remaining men circled him warily now, having learned respect for his knife. "Enough!" The red-haired leader pulled a revolver. "Fun's over. Drop the knife. Indian." Standing Moon straightened slowly, chest heaving. His eyes found Margaret's, and she saw him calculating, comply and hope for mercy, or fight and certainly die. "I said drop it." The gun barrel steadied, aimed at Standing Moon's chest. The knife fell to the ground with a soft thud. "That's better." The leader grinned nastily. "Now, about that lesson in respect." One of his men grabbed Standing Moon's arms from behind, holding him as the leader holstered his gun and pulled out a length of rope. "String him up, boys. Let him dance a bit, then we'll have our fun with his woman." "No!" Margaret slid from her horse, stumbling as she hit the ground. "Please, he saved my life. He's done nothing wrong." "Nothing wrong?" The leader laughed. "Riding with a white woman, acting like he's as good as us? That's wrong enough." Tears streamed down Margaret's face as they dragged Standing Moon toward a sturdy cottonwood tree. He didn't struggle, didn't cry out, just kept his eyes on her with a look that seemed to say, "Run." But she couldn't run. Not again. Not when the only person who'd shown her kindness in weeks was about to die for it. "Wait," she stepped forward, forcing authority into her voice. "I'm Margaret Sullivan, widow of Thomas Sullivan. This man is escorting me to Fort Bridger under Army orders. If you harm him, you'll answer to the military authorities." The lie came so easily it surprised her. The men paused, uncertainty flickering across their faces. The frontier had little law, but the Army was one force even outlaws respected. The red-haired leader studied her suspiciously. Army orders? Where's your papers? Lost when my horse went lame 5 days ago, Margaret said, lifting her chin. Why do you think I'm riding with an Indian guide? All the white scouts were already hired. She's lying, Jake, one of the men muttered. Maybe, Jake said slowly. Or maybe not. Question is, do we want to risk it? The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Margaret held her breath, praying her bluff would hold. Standing Moon remained motionless in his captor's grip, blood still trickling down his face. Finally, Jake spat. Let him go. The men released Standing Moon reluctantly. He swayed slightly but remained standing, his expression unreadable. But if I see either of you again, Jake continued, Army orders or not, we'll finish what we started. Get your water and get out. Margaret helped Standing Moon to the creek, her hands shaking as she filled their water skins. The men watched with hostile eyes, occasionally muttering threats and obscenities. She could feel Standing Moon trembling, whether from pain or suppressed rage. She couldn't tell. They mounted slowly, Margaret having to help boost Standing Moon onto his horse. As they rode away, jeers and curses followed them, but no bullets. Only when they were well out of sight did Standing Moon slump forward, one hand pressed to his ribs. You're hurt, Margaret said, fear making her voice sharp. We need to stop. Not here, he gasped. Too close. They rode for another hour before Standing Moon finally guided them into a hidden grove. He half fell from his horse, and Margaret caught him, staggering under his weight. Blood had soaked through his shirt where she hadn't noticed a knife wound during the fight. Why didn't you tell me? She demanded, helping him sit against a tree. Would not have changed anything. His face was gray with pain. Margaret tore strips from her petticoat, using water from their precious supply to clean the wound. It was deep, but clean, missing anything vital. Her hands shook as she bound it tightly. You risked your life for me, Standing Moon said quietly as she worked. You were about to die because of me, she replied, tears falling freely now. Because you helped a white woman. Because you were kind. He caught one of her hands in his, stilling its frantic movements. No, they would have found reason to hate, with or without you. This is how it is now. Margaret looked at their joined hands. His bronze, scarred from years of survival. Hers pale, still bearing the calluses of her former life. The contrast should have seemed stark, wrong. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Thank you, he said simply. For the lie, it was well spoken. I couldn't let them. She couldn't finish, overwhelmed by the realization of how much this man had come to mean to her in such a short time. Standing Moon squeezed her hand gently. You are safe. That is what matters. As the sun began its descent, Margaret tended his injuries with a care that surprised them both. Something had shifted between them in those violent moments by the creek, a bond forged in shared danger and mutual sacrifice. She had seen him fight for her, and he had seen her fight for him. In this harsh land, perhaps that was the truest foundation for any connection. That night, she sat closer to him by the fire, no longer separated by the careful distance they'd maintained. When he winced, trying to find a comfortable position, she wordlessly moved to support his wounded side, letting him lean against her. You are not like other white women, he observed quietly. Maybe I never was. Margaret replied, maybe I just needed to come to this wild place to find out who I really am, under the vast desert stars. With danger behind them and uncertainty ahead, they found comfort in each other's presence. Two outcasts who had discovered that sometimes the most unexpected connections are the strongest. The wound forced them to travel slowly, taking routes that avoided well-used trails where they might encounter more hostile groups. Standing Moon guided them through terrain Margaret would never have attempted alone. Narrow canyon passages where the walls rose like ancient sentinels, across mesa tops where the wind sang lonely songs, through hidden valleys where small springs sustained pockets of green in the vast brown landscape. With each passing day, Standing Moon grew stronger. Though Margaret insisted on checking his bandages each morning and evening, these moments of tending had become something more than medical necessity. When her fingers brushed his skin, testing for fever, both of them felt the charge of connection. When he winced at her ministrations, she found herself murmuring soothing words in the mixture of English and his language she'd been learning. They made camp one evening beside a cluster of ancient ruins, stone walls that had stood for centuries before either of their peoples had claimed this land. The sunset painted the desert in shades of fire, and somewhere in the distance, wolves began their evening chorus. "My ribs are nearly healed," Standing Moon said as Margaret unwound the bandages. The wound had closed cleanly, leaving what would become another scar among many. "Nearly isn't completely," she replied, but they both knew she was searching for reasons to maintain this ritual of care. Her hands lingered on the edges of the wound, feeling the warmth of his skin, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. He caught her hand, holding it against his chest, where his heart beat strong and steady. "Margaret," he said, her name still carrying a slight unfamiliarity on his tongue. "What are we doing?" She knew what he meant. Every day took them farther from their original purpose, her vague plan to reach California, his solitary existence in the desert. Yet neither spoke of parting. Neither suggested a destination beyond the next water source, the next sheltered camping spot. "I don't know," she admitted, not pulling her hand away. "I only know that when I think of riding on alone, everything in me rebels against it." His thumb traced small circles on her wrist, a touch so gentle it made her shiver. "Among my people, a woman chooses her own path, but the path you walk with me, it leads nowhere easy." "Has any path in my life led somewhere easy?" Margaret asked with a bitter laugh. "At least this path has what?" "You," she whispered, the word hanging between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Standing Moon released her hand slowly, but only to cup her face, his palm rough against her cheek. "You came to me like rain to dry earth," he said. "I had forgotten I was dying of thirst until you reminded me what water tasted like." Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks, tasting salt and possibility. When he leaned toward her, she met him halfway, their lips touching in a kiss that was gentle as morning light, yet held the promise of deeper fires. When they pulled apart, both breathing unsteadily, reality crashed back. She was a white widow. He was an Indian warrior. The world beyond their small camp would never understand, never accept. "I'm frightened," Margaret admitted. "Of me?" "No, of how much I'm not frightened of you, of how right this feels when everything about it should feel wrong." Standing Moon gathered wood for the fire, his movements careful as he processed her words. "The heart does not see the boundaries that men draw," he finally said. "It sees only another heart that answers its call." They traveled for 3 more days, the atmosphere between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Every accidental touch sparked awareness. Every shared glance held weight. At night, they still maintained separate sleeping areas, but the distance between them had shrunk to mere feet rather than the careful yards of before. On the 4th day, the landscape began to change. More vegetation appeared, and in the distance, they could see the smoke of settlement fires. Standing Moon grew increasingly tense, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. "There's a trading post ahead," he said. "Fort Hancock. We need supplies." Margaret understood his concern. The last encounter with white men had nearly ended in death, but their food was running low, and they needed ammunition for the rifles Standing Moon carried. "I'll go in alone," she suggested. "They won't question a white woman." "No." His response was immediate and fierce. "We stay together or not at all." As they approached Fort Hancock, Margaret felt her stomach knot with anxiety. The trading post was larger than she'd expected, a cluster of buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade, with people and wagons moving in and out of the gates. They attracted stares the moment they entered. Women in calico dresses whispered behind their hands. Men lounging outside the saloon straightened, eyes narrowing with suspicion and worse. Margaret forced herself to ride tall, meeting their gazes with what she hoped was confident indifference. At the general store, the proprietor, a thin man with suspicious eyes, looked between them with obvious distaste. "We don't serve Indians here," he said flatly. "Then serve me," Margaret said, dismounting with as much dignity as she could muster. "I require supplies for my journey." "Your journey with him?" The man's lip curled. "What kind of respectable woman? The kind who minds her own business, as I suggest you mind yours." Margaret interrupted, surprised by her own boldness. "Will you take my money, or shall I find another establishment?" Greed won over prejudice. The man began gathering the items Margaret requested, though he made his displeasure known through rough handling and muttered comments. Standing Moon remained outside with the horses, his presence a silent guardian that both reassured and worried her, as she paid, counting out coins from the small purse she'd managed to save. A familiar voice made her blood run cold. "Margaret, Margaret Sullivan." She turned to find Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, a woman from Silver Creek whose husband had worked in the same mine as Thomas. Adelaide's eyes went wide, taking in Margaret's sun-darkened skin, her modified riding dress, and most of all, the Indian waiting outside. "My dear, what has happened to you?" Adelaide's voice carried that particular mix of scandal and delight that meant this story would spread like wildfire. "We heard you'd left town, but this—" "I'm traveling to California," Margaret said stiffly. "Mr. Standing Moon is my guide." "Your guide?" Adelaide's voice rose. "My dear, no decent woman. What would poor Thomas think?" Something snapped inside Margaret. The weeks of hardship, the near-death experience, the fight by the creek. Standing Moon's wounds suffered in her defense. All of it crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. "Thomas is dead," she said quietly but firmly. What he would think ceased to matter the moment they pulled his crushed body from that mine. "I'm alive, Mrs. Morrison," which is more than anyone in Silver Creek expected or perhaps wanted. "Now, if you'll excuse me." She turned to leave, but Adelaide caught her arm. "You're making a terrible mistake. These people, they're not like us. Whatever hold he has on you—" Margaret looked down at the woman's hand on her arm, then up at her face. "The only hold he has on me is kindness. Mrs. Morrison. He saved my life when your people like us would have let me die. He's shown me more honor and respect than any white man since my husband passed. Now release me." Adelaide recoiled as if slapped. Margaret gathered her supplies and walked out, head high, aware of the eyes following her. Standing Moon read the tension in her face and body, but said nothing as she secured the supplies to her horse. As they rode out of Fort Hancock, Margaret could feel the weight of judgment pressing against her back. She knew what would happen now. Word would spread. Margaret Sullivan, the widow who went native, the fallen woman who chose a savage over civilization. "You are troubled," Standing Moon observed once they were well away from the settlement. "I met someone from Silver Creek. By tomorrow, everyone will know where I am, who I'm with." She laughed, but it held no humor. "I suppose my reputation is now thoroughly destroyed. Do you care?" Margaret considered this as they rode. Did she care? Months ago, the thought of social disgrace would have terrified her. Now, after facing death, finding unexpected companionship, discovering strength she didn't know she possessed, the opinions of people like Adelaide Morrison seemed remarkably insignificant. "No," she said finally, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. "I don't care." That evening, they camped by a stream lined with cottonwoods. As Margaret prepared their simple meal, Standing Moon approached with uncharacteristic hesitation. "The woman at the trading post, she offered you a path back to your world. You could have taken it." Margaret looked up from the fire. Seeing the uncertainty in his eyes, this strong man who faced armed enemies without flinching was afraid she might leave. "That's not my world anymore," she said simply. "Maybe it never really was." She rose and went to him, placing her hands on his chest, feeling his heart race beneath her palms. "I choose this path. Standing Moon, I choose you, if you'll have me." Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because nowhere else is where I want to be. He covered her hands with his eyes searching hers. To be with me is to be forever between worlds, never fully accepted by mine or yours. Then we'll make our own world, Margaret said fiercely. Somewhere in this vast land, there must be a place for two people who refuse to let others define who they can love. This time when he kissed her, there was no hesitation, no holding back. The kiss spoke of decision made, boundaries crossed, futures chosen despite all odds. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, Margaret saw her own wonder reflected in his eyes. You are my heart's choice. Standing Moon said simply, whatever comes, we face it together. As night fell around them and the stars emerged in their eternal dance, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Hope. Not for an easy life, but for a life lived true to her heart. In choosing Standing Moon, she had chosen herself, the woman she was becoming in this harsh and beautiful land. The fire crackled between them as they sat close together, planning their next moves, their voices mixing with the night sounds of the desert. Two souls who had found each other against all probability, ready to face whatever judgment the world might offer, sustained by a love that recognized no boundaries save those of the heart. The town of Cedar Ridge sprawled before them like a collection of wooden blocks dropped carelessly on the desert floor. It was larger than Fort Hancock, boasting a main street lined with businesses, a church with a white steeple piercing the cloudless sky, and enough people to make Standing Moon tense in his saddle. We don't have to stop here, Margaret said quietly, sensing his discomfort. We need grain for the horses and medicine for travel, he replied, though his eyes never stopped scanning for trouble. I will wait outside the town. You go. No? Margaret's voice was firm. We agreed, together or not at all. They rode in side by side, and the reaction was immediate. A woman pulling her children along the boardwalk stopped mid-stride, her mouth falling open. Men lounging outside the barber shop straightened, their conversations dying. By the time they reached the general store, it felt as if the entire town was watching. Margaret dismounted with deliberate calm, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Standing Moon followed, his movements fluid and alert. They'd barely stepped onto the boardwalk when a voice cut through the air like a whip. That's her! That's the widow from Silver Creek! Margaret turned to see Adelaide Morrison emerging from the millinery shop, flanked by two other women whose expressions mixed scandal with righteous indignation. Word had traveled even faster than she'd expected. Margaret Sullivan, Adelaide announced loudly enough for half the street to hear. Have you lost all sense of Christian decency? A crowd began to gather, drawn by the promise of drama. Margaret felt Standing Moon shift slightly, positioning himself protectively, and she touched his arm in warning. Violence here would only make things worse. Mrs. Morrison, Margaret said evenly. I wasn't aware my travel arrangements required your approval. Travel arrangements. A man pushed through the crowd, tall, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone important. Ma'am, I'm Sheriff Watson. Is this Indian bothering you? Not at all. Sheriff, Mr. Standing Moon is my companion. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Then the crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. The sheriff's face darkened. Your companion? Ma'am, perhaps you don't understand the impropriety. I understand perfectly. Margaret lifted her chin. I also understand that there's no law against traveling with whomever I choose. The law of common decency, Adelaide shrieked. The law of God! You're consorting with a savage, bringing shame to your poor husband's memory! The crowd pressed closer, their faces ugly with judgment. Someone spat at Standing Moon's feet. Another man muttered something about teaching them both a lesson. Margaret felt the situation spiraling toward violence. Shame? Margaret's voice rose, surprising herself with its strength. You want to talk about shame, Mrs. Morrison? Where was your Christian charity when I was starving in Silver Creek? Where was decency when the good men of the town offered to help me in ways that would make the devil blush? She looked around at the crowd, meeting their eyes one by one. This man saved my life when I was dying in the desert. He shared his food, his shelter, his protection, asking nothing in return. If that makes him a savage, then civilization has nothing I want. Pretty words, Sheriff Watson said coldly. But they don't change facts. No decent town wants your kind here. You've made your choice. Now live with it elsewhere. You're throwing us out? Margaret couldn't hide her disbelief. For what crime? For the peace of the community, the sheriff replied. You can buy your supplies and leave, or leave now with nothing. Choose. The crowd murmured approval, some calling out cruder suggestions. Standing Moon hadn't spoken, but Margaret could feel the tension radiating from him, the effort it took not to respond to their provocations. We'll take our business elsewhere, Margaret said with as much dignity as she could muster. As they turned to leave, a stone flew from the crowd, striking Standing Moon's shoulder. He barely flinched, but Margaret whirled around, fury blazing in her eyes. Who threw that? Who among you righteous people attacks a man who's done nothing but exist? No one answered, but she saw the satisfaction in their faces, the mob mentality that turned neighbors into strangers, humans into something less. Cowards, she said clearly. Every one of you. Another stone flew, this time grazing Margaret's cheek. Blood welled from the cut, and Standing Moon's control finally snapped. Not toward violence, but action. In one smooth motion, he lifted Margaret onto his horse, mounted his own, and they rode out as more stones and curses followed them. They didn't stop until Cedar Ridge was far behind, finally halting in a grove of juniper trees. Margaret's hands shook as she touched the cut on her cheek, the blood already drying in the desert air. Let me see, Standing Moon said gently, producing a clean cloth and water from his supplies. As he tended the wound, tears finally came, not from pain, but from rage and frustration. They wouldn't even sell to us, wouldn't even pretend to be civilized. This is not new to me, Standing Moon said quietly, but I'm sorry you must face it. I'm not sorry, Margaret said fiercely. I'm angry. How do you bear it? How do you not hate them all? He was quiet for a moment, finishing his ministrations. Hate is a poison you drink hoping others will die. I have seen what it does to the spirit. I choose not to carry it. You're stronger than I am. No? He cupped her face gently, thumb brushing away her tears. You stood before that crowd and spoke truth. That takes a different kind of strength. They found another town 2 days later, smaller, rougher, a mining camp that had grown into something resembling civilization. The stairs were still there, but greed outweighed prejudice. The shopkeeper took their money, though he refused to look at either of them directly. As Margaret gathered supplies, she overheard 2 women talking near the fabric display. Did you hear about the widow in Cedar Ridge, living in sin with an Indian? Shameful, though I heard she was touched in the head with grief. Maybe not right in her mind. No excuse for such behavior. If my William died, I'd rather starve than disgrace myself so. Margaret's hand stilled on a bolt of cloth. A month ago, such words would have cut deep. Now they seemed to come from another world, one she no longer inhabited or understood. Outside, she found Standing Moon watering the horses at the trough. 3 men watched from across the street, making no effort to hide their hostility. We should move on soon, he said quietly. I'm tired of running, Margaret replied, surprising herself with the vehemence. Tired of being judged by people who know nothing of what we've survived. That evening, they camped near a small lake, the water reflecting the painted sky. Margaret sat close to Standing Moon, no longer maintaining any pretense of distance. When he wrapped his blanket around both of them against the cooling air, she leaned into his warmth without hesitation. Do you regret, he asked suddenly, the choice you made? Margaret considered the question honestly. In choosing him, she had lost any chance of returning to respectable society. She would always be the widow who went native, the woman who chose a savage over civilization. There would be no comfortable home, no social calls, no acceptance in any white community. I regret that the world is not ready for us, she said finally. I regret the ugliness we've faced and will continue to face. But regret choosing you? She turned to look at him directly. Never. Not for a single moment. He kissed her then, under the vast western sky. And she tasted promise and challenge in equal measure. When they parted, she saw her own determination reflected in his eyes. There are places, he said slowly, farther west, farther north, where people care less about such things. Where mixed families live in relative peace. It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is. Margaret interrupted. I didn't survive the desert to live an easy life. I survived to live a true one. That night, as they held each other beneath the stars, Margaret thought about the women in the shop, clinging to their narrow definitions of respectability. She had traded their world for this. A bedroll on hard ground. An uncertain future. The constant weight of society's disapproval, and yet listening to Standing Moon's heartbeat, feeling his arms around her. She knew she had gained far more than she had lost. I love you, she whispered into the darkness, the words coming as naturally as breath. And I love you, he replied in his language, then in hers, sealing their fate with words that no amount of stones or scandalized whispers could undo. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new towns to face or avoid. New decisions about where and how to build a life together. But tonight, they had each other in the stubborn, revolutionary decision to love despite all odds. In a world that demanded they stay apart, their togetherness was its own quiet rebellion. Their love, a testament to the power of choosing one's own path, whatever the cost. The first gunshots cracked through the evening air just as Margaret was drawing water from the well. She dropped the bucket, water splashing across her boots, and ran toward the main street of Prosperity Falls. They had arrived in the small town that morning, hoping its remote location might mean less hostility. But now, screams mixed with gunfire shattered that hope. Standing Moon appeared at her side as if materialized from shadow, his rifle already in hand. Raiders, he said tersely, pulling her behind a water trough as bullets whined overhead. Through the chaos, Margaret could see masked men on horseback charging down the main street, firing wildly. The bank door hung open, and two men were dragging heavy bags toward waiting horses. Store windows shattered. A woman ran screaming from the hotel, clutching a child. Get to shelter. Standing Moon pushed Margaret toward the nearest building, the church. Go! Not without you! I must help. His eyes were fierce with determination. These people may hate us, but children don't deserve to die for their parents' prejudices. Before she could protest, he was gone, moving with deadly grace between buildings. Margaret saw him pull a young boy from the path of a galloping horse, then help an elderly man who'd been knocked down in the panic. More shots rang out. The sheriff and his two deputies were pinned behind overturned wagons, desperately returning fire but clearly outgunned. Margaret watched in horror as one deputy fell, clutching his shoulder. Standing Moon moved like his namesake, silent, swift, inevitable. Using the chaos as cover, he worked his way to a position above the raiders, climbing onto the roof of the hardware store. His first shot took a raider from his saddle. The second sent another's gun spinning from his hand. The raiders, realizing they were taking fire from an unexpected position, turned their attention to the rooftop. Margaret's heart seized as bullets splintered the wooden shingles around Standing Moon. He rolled, fired again, then dropped from sight. A raider broke from the group, riding hard toward the church, toward Margaret. She pressed herself against the wall, wishing she had a weapon. Any weapon. The man's eyes glinted with malice above his bandana as he raised his pistol. The shot came from her left. The raider toppled backward from his horse, and Margaret saw Sheriff Watson lowering his smoking gun. Their eyes met for a moment, the same man who had been ready to throw them out of Cedar Ridge just days before. Get inside, woman, he barked before turning back to the fight. But Margaret couldn't move, couldn't look away as Standing Moon reappeared, this time from behind the saloon. He moved with terrible efficiency, each shot carefully placed. A raider charging toward the school where children huddled inside never made it to the door. Another, trying to trample fleeing townspeople, found his horse shot from under him. The tide began to turn, emboldened by Standing Moon's actions. Townsmen grabbed weapons and joined the defense. The raiders, realizing their quick strike had become a prolonged battle, began to retreat. Their leader, a giant of a man with cold eyes, shouted orders to fall back. As they fled, one raider, younger than the rest, his mask slipping, turned back for one last act of vengeance. He aimed at a group of women and children huddled by the millinery shop. Time seemed to slow as Margaret saw Standing Moon break from cover, running full speed to put himself between the gun and the innocents. The shots came simultaneously, the raider's wild spray and Standing Moon's single, precise bullet. The raider fell. Standing Moon staggered but kept his feet, herding the terrified group to safety even as blood began to stain his shirt. "No!" Margaret ran to him as he finally collapsed behind a wagon. His face was gray with pain, but his eyes were clear. "The children?" he asked. "Safe. All safe because of you." She pressed her hands against the wound in his side, trying to stem the bleeding. "Why? These people despise us." "Not the children," he said simply. "Never the children." The battle was over. The surviving raiders had fled, leaving their dead behind. As the dust settled and the extent of the damage became clear, townspeople began emerging from their hiding places. Many bore wounds, some serious, but the death toll could have been far worse. Margaret was vaguely aware of people gathering around them, of shocked whispers as they realized who had helped save their town. Someone, she didn't see who, handed her clean cloths for bandages. Another brought water. Doc Harrigan, the town physician, pushed through the crowd. He hesitated for just a moment, seeing who his patient was. Then professional duty won over prejudice. "Let me see," he said gruffly, kneeling beside Standing Moon. As the doctor worked, Sheriff Watson approached, hat in hand. His arm was in a makeshift sling, and his face bore the complexity of a man forced to reconsider everything he thought he knew. "He saved us," the sheriff said unnecessarily. "Saved folks who wouldn't have given him the time of day. He saved them because that's who he is," Margaret said fiercely, not caring that tears streamed down her face. "A better man than any who've judged him." The crowd grew larger. Margaret recognized some faces from earlier. The woman who'd pulled her children away from them. The shopkeeper who'd served them with such obvious distaste. Now they stood silent, wrestling with the contradiction between their prejudices and what they'd witnessed. A small girl pushed through the forest of legs, clutching a ragged doll. She was maybe 6 years old, with golden curls and a dirt-smudged face. Margaret recognized her as one of the children Standing Moon had shielded. "Is the Indian man going to die?" she asked with a child's directness. "No," Margaret said firmly, as much prayer as declaration. "No, he's not." The girl studied Standing Moon's face with solemn blue eyes, then placed her doll on his chest. "For being brave," she announced, then scampered back to her mother. Doc Harrigan finished his work, sitting back on his heels. "Bullet went clean through. Missed anything vital, though he's lost considerable blood. He needs rest, careful tending, and a good deal of luck. Then he'll have all three," Margaret said. "Where will you take him?" the doctor asked. "The hotel won't—" He stopped, flushing. "Won't take an Indian," Margaret finished bitterly. "Even one who bled for this town." An uncomfortable silence fell. Then, unexpectedly, a woman stepped forward. Margaret recognized her as Mrs. Elmira Patterson, the minister's wife, steel-haired and ramrod straight. "They'll stay at the parsonage," she announced in a tone that brooked no argument. "We have a spare room, and it's the least we can do." Shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd. Minister Patterson, a mild man who usually deferred to his formidable wife, cleared his throat nervously. "Elmira, perhaps we should discuss—" "What's to discuss?" "Harold?" She fixed him with a look that had quelled stronger men. "This man risked his life for our town. Would you have us repay courage with cowardice?" As they carried Standing Moon to the parsonage, Margaret walked beside the makeshift stretcher, holding his hand. The crowd parted before them. some faces still hard with disapproval, but others showing something new, uncertainty, perhaps, or the beginning of respect. Over the next days, as Standing Moon fought infection and fever, an interesting transformation occurred in Prosperity Falls. People began to appear at the parsonage door, not many, and not the most prominent citizens, but some. A woman whose son Standing Moon had saved brought fresh bread. A farmer left vegetables from his garden. The little girl with the doll came daily to check on the brave Indian man. Not everyone softened. Margaret still heard whispers, still caught hostile glances, but something had shifted in the balance when Adelaide Morrison arrived from Cedar Ridge, eager to spread her poisonous gossip. She found a less receptive audience than expected. "He's still a savage," Adelaide insisted to a group of women at the general store. "One good deed doesn't change that." "Maybe not," replied Mrs. Patterson, who'd taken to defending her houseguests with surprising vigor. "But I'd rather have one savage who protects children than a dozen civilized men who stand by and do nothing." On the fourth day, Standing Moon's fever broke. Margaret was dozing in a chair beside his bed when she felt his hand move in hers. His eyes were clear when she looked up, truly seeing her for the first time since the shooting. "You stayed," he said softly. "Where else would I be?" She brought his hand to her lips. "You beautiful, foolish man. You nearly died for people who hate us." "Not for them," he corrected. "For what is right, for the chance that someday, somewhere, a child will grow up remembering that an Indian saved her life. Maybe she'll think differently because of it." Margaret thought of the little girl with the doll, her innocent face unmarked by the prejudices of her elders. Perhaps Standing Moon was right. Perhaps change came not in grand gestures, but in small moments of courage that planted seeds in young hearts. "I love you," she said, the words carrying all her fear, relief, and hope. "And I love you," he replied. "My brave woman who stands before crowds and speaks truth." Sheriff Watson visited that evening, hat literally in hand. He stood awkwardly in the doorway until Margaret invited him in. "I came to say thank you," he said to Standing Moon, "and to apologize. I judged wrongly." Standing Moon studied him for a long moment. "We all carry the prejudices of our raising. The measure of a man is whether he can see past them." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Well, I'm seeing clearer now. You'll have no trouble from the law in Prosperity Falls. I promise you that." It wasn't acceptance, not fully, but it was a beginning. As Margaret showed the sheriff out, she realized that perhaps this was how the world changed. Not all at once, but one person, one act of courage, one shifted perspective at a time. That night, as Standing Moon slept peacefully for the first time since the shooting, Margaret sat by the window watching the town settle into evening routines. Somewhere out there, a little girl was probably sleeping with her returned doll. Somewhere, people were retelling the story of the raid, and in each telling, the Indian who'd helped save them became a little more human. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd set out from Silver Creek, broken and desperate, but holding Standing Moon's hand in the lamplight, feeling the steady beat of his pulse. Margaret knew she wouldn't trade it for any amount of social acceptance. They had found something rarer than approval. They had found truth, love, and the courage to live it regardless of the cost. The morning they left Prosperity Falls, a small crowd gathered to see them off. Not the whole town. Many still clung to their prejudices, but enough to make Margaret's throat tight with unexpected emotion. "Mrs. Patterson pressed a bundle of food into her hands, while Doc Harrigan checked Standing Moon's bandages one last time. "You could stay," the minister's wife said quietly. "It wouldn't be easy, but you've started something here. People are talking, thinking differently." Margaret looked at Standing Moon, seeing her own answer reflected in his eyes. "Thank you," she said gently, "but we need to find our own place. Somewhere we can build a life without constantly fighting to justify our existence." The little girl with the doll ran forward, tugging at Standing Moon's leg until he bent down to her level. "Are you going on an adventure?" she asked. "Yes, little one," he said solemnly. A great adventure. She nodded as if this made perfect sense, then pressed something into his hand, a smooth river stone. For luck, she announced before running back to her mother. As they rode out, Sheriff Watson tipped his hat, and several others followed suit. It was a far cry from the stones and curses that had driven them from Cedar Ridge, and Margaret treasured the difference. They traveled north and west, following rivers and mountain passes that Standing Moon knew from his younger days. The landscape changed gradually, desert giving way to grassland, then to forests of pine and aspen. They met other travelers occasionally, some hostile, others merely curious. But they kept moving, searching for something they couldn't quite name. Tell me again about the place you mentioned, Margaret said one evening as they camped beside a crystal-clear stream, where mixed families live in peace. Standing Moon poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward. It's called Haven Valley. My mother's cousin went there many years ago when she married a French trapper. They say people there care more about how you treat your neighbors than who your ancestors were. It sounds too good to be true. Perhaps, but sometimes hope is worth the journey, even if the destination disappoints. They rode for 2 more weeks, the terrain growing increasingly rugged. Standing Moon's wound had healed well, leaving another scar to join his collection. But Margaret noticed he still favored that side when the days were long. Late one afternoon, they crested a ridge and stopped in mutual awe. Below them stretched a valley painted in shades of gold and green, bisected by a silver ribbon of river. Smoke rose from scattered cabins, and in the distance, they could make out what looked like a small town nestled against the mountain's base. Haven Valley? Margaret breathed. We'll see. Standing Moon replied, but she heard the hope in his voice. They descended slowly, aware that they were being watched. A man emerged from the trees, tall, weathered, with skin that spoke of mixed heritage. He carried a rifle but kept it pointed down. Strangers aren't common here, he said in accented English. State your business. We seek a place to build a life. Standing Moon replied simply, nothing more, nothing less. The man studied them. Margaret in her trail-worn dress, Standing Moon in his mix of native and settler clothing, their horses loaded with all their worldly possessions. You running from something or towards something? Both, Margaret said honestly. Is that a problem? For the first time, the man smiled. Half the folks in Haven Valley could say the same. Come, I'll take you to Jacob Moreau. He speaks for the community. Jacob Moreau turned out to be a gray-bearded man with shrewd eyes and hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. His wife, Sarah, had the high cheekbones and dark eyes that suggested native ancestry, while their children showed the beautiful blend of their heritage. So, Jacob said after they'd shared their story over cups of strong coffee, you want to settle in Haven Valley. What can you offer our community? Margaret started to speak of her skills with needle and thread, her ability to read and write. But Standing Moon placed a gentle hand on her arm. We offer ourselves, he said. Our willingness to work, to defend what needs defending, to respect what deserves respect. We ask only for the chance to prove our worth through actions, not bloodlines. Jacob and Sarah exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. We've a patch of land up near the North Bend, Sarah said finally. Cabin needs work, but it's solid. You can use it through winter. See if Haven Valley suits you and you suit Haven Valley. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. After so much rejection, this simple acceptance overwhelmed her. Thank you, she managed. Don't thank us yet, Jacob warned, but not unkindly. Winter here is harsh, and building a life from nothing is harder still. Come spring, we'll see if thanks are still in order. The cabin was small and needed significant repair, but to Margaret, it looked like a palace. Standing Moon immediately set about checking the roof while she explored the single room with its stone fireplace and sturdy walls. We'll need supplies before snow, he said, climbing down. Tools, provisions, warm clothing. I can take in sewing, earn money. He corrected gently. We will earn what we need. Together. Over the following days. The community of Haven Valley revealed itself. There was Pierre, the blacksmith with French and Cree blood, who offered standing moon work in exchange for tools. Maria, whose Spanish father had married a Cherokee woman, needed help with her late harvest and paid in preserved vegetables. The schoolteacher, a war widow named Catherine, shyly asked if Margaret might assist with the younger children in exchange for fabric and thread. Not everyone welcomed them warmly. Some kept their distance, waiting to see what kind of people they truly were. But there was no open hostility, no stones thrown or curses shouted. It was, Margaret realized, exactly what they'd hoped for, the chance to be judged as individuals rather than symbols. As autumn deepened, they worked to make the cabin livable. Standing Moon hunted and repaired, while Margaret sewed and taught and learned to preserve meat for winter. In the evenings, they sat by their own fire in their own home, and the simple joy of it never failed to move her. "I need to tell you something," Margaret said one night as the first snow began to fall. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat belly. "We're going to have a child." Standing Moon's face transformed with wonder and joy, then quickly shifted to concern. "Are you well? Do you need—" "I'm perfect," she interrupted, laughing and crying at once. "We're perfect." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of spun glass. "A child," he whispered. "Our child. Born free," Margaret said fiercely, "into a place where they can be proud of both their heritages." The winter was indeed hard, but they faced it together. The community, seeing Margaret's condition, rallied in quiet ways. Extra firewood appeared outside their door. Sarah Moreau visited with herbs for morning sickness. Even the skeptics seemed to soften, perhaps remembering their own struggles. Spring arrived with a rush of melting snow and new green. Margaret, heavy with child, stood in the doorway of their cabin watching Standing Moon work their small garden plot. The sun caught in his hair, and she marveled at how far they'd come from that desperate day on the desert trail. "No regrets?" he asked, catching her watching. "None," she said firmly, "except perhaps that I didn't faint on that particular trail sooner." He laughed, a sound she'd treasured for its rarity, and came to wrap his arms around her expanded waist. The spirits work in mysterious ways, as if in agreement. The baby kicked, and they stood together in the doorway of their home, looking out over the valley that had given them sanctuary. It wasn't an easy life they'd chosen, and there would be challenges ahead. There always were for those who dared to love across the boundaries others drew. But it was their life, built on their terms, founded on love that had survived the worst the world could throw at it. In a few weeks, their child would be born, not white, not Indian, but simply and beautifully both. A living bridge between worlds, proof that love could flourish even in the harshest ground. Standing Moon lifted Margaret into his arms, carrying her over the threshold as he had that first day, though now with infinite tenderness rather than desperate urgency. "You're my heart's home," he murmured against her hair. "And you're my soul's journey," she replied, sealing their fate with a kiss that tasted of spring rain and new beginnings. In the vast tapestry of the American West, their thread was small but bright, a love that refused to be defined by others' limitations, a life built on courage and compassion rather than convention. And in Haven Valley, beneath the eternal mountains and endless sky, they wrote their own story. One day, one season, one precious moment at a time. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. And somewhere in the distance, an eagle cried, wild and free, soaring above all earthly boundaries, just as love was always meant to do. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect with you. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and let us know your thoughts on Margaret and Standing Moon's journey. Your feedback means the world to us.